They thought she was an easy target, but this quiet girl had deadly secrets that left her bullies begging for mercy. The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Jefferson High School as 17-year-old Arya Nakamura stood in the main office, clutching a manila folder containing her transfer documents. Her long black hair fell like a curtain across half her face, and she kept her dark eyes fixed on the worn linoleum floor, a habit she developed over years of trying to remain invisible. At 5'4" with a slight build, she looked even smaller in her oversized navy hoodie and dark jeans, the kind of girl who seemed to apologize for taking up space just by existing. Principal Matthews, a balding man in his 50s with coffee stains on his shirt, barely looked up from his computer screen as he handed her a class schedule. "Welcome to Jefferson High, Miss Nakamura. Your locker assignment is 247. Combination is written on the back of your schedule. Try not to cause any trouble." His dismissive tone suggested he'd already categorized her as just another problem to manage, another face in the crowd of nearly 3,000 students that moved through these halls daily. Arya nodded silently, her fingers unconsciously touching the small silver pendant hanging beneath her hoodie, a tiger's claw her grandfather had given her before he died, along with lessons she'd never mentioned to anyone. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. As she stepped into the hallway, the overwhelming cacophony of teenage voices, slamming lockers and squeaking sneakers hit her like a physical wall. Jefferson High was enormous compared to her previous school in Portland, with endless corridors that branched off in confusing directions, painted in that institutional beige that seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Students moved in established clusters. The athletes with their Letterman jackets and confident swagger, the theater kids with their dramatic gestures and paint-stained fingers, the academics clutching their textbooks like shields, and dozens of other micro-societies that had formed their own unspoken rules and territories. Arya had hoped that moving to Millbrook, a mid-sized town in Ohio, would give her family a fresh start after her father's job transfer. Her parents, both software engineers who worked long hours and communicated primarily through sticky notes left on the refrigerator, had been enthusiastic about the opportunities a larger school would provide. They didn't understand that for someone like Arya, who had always been more comfortable with books than people, a bigger school just meant more places to hide and more people to avoid. She found locker 247 wedged between a dented blue locker covered in band stickers and another that someone had apparently tried to kick open, leaving a permanent foot-shaped impression in the metal. As she fumbled with the combination lock, her hands trembling slightly from nerves, she became aware of voices approaching from behind, loud, confident voices that seemed to cut through the general noise of the hallway like knives. Well, what do we have here?" The voice belonged to Brandon Reeves, though Arya didn't know his name yet. At 18, Brandon was the kind of guy who peaked in high school and would spend the rest of his life trying to recapture these glory days. 6 feet tall, with carefully styled blonde hair and the broad shoulders of someone who spent more time in the weight room than the classroom, he moved through the school like he owned it. His father was a city councilman, his mother ran the largest real estate agency in town, and Brandon had grown up believing the world owed him everything he wanted. "Looks like fresh meat," added Tyler Morrison, Brandon's constant companion and eager enabler. Tyler was shorter and stockier, with red hair and the kind of aggressive personality that overcompensated for deep-seated insecurities. His father had abandoned the family when Tyler was 12, leaving him with anger issues and a desperate need to prove his worth by associating with someone like Brandon. The third member of their little pack was Derek Chen, a tall, lanky boy whose parents had moved to Millbrook from California when he was 10. Derek had learned early that aligning himself with the popular kids was easier than being targeted for his ethnicity, though the irony wasn't lost on him that he was now about to participate in bullying another Asian student. His silence spoke volumes about the compromises people made to survive high school's brutal social ecosystem. Arya felt their presence before she saw them, the way prey animals sense predators. Her grandfather had taught her to trust those instincts, to always be aware of her surroundings, but she forced herself to focus on her locker combination, hoping they would lose interest and move on. The lock clicked open on her second try, and she began transferring books from her backpack to the narrow metal space, keeping her movements small and unobtrusive. "Hey, I'm talking to you," Brandon said, stepping closer until his shadow fell across her locker. She could smell his cologne, something expensive and overwhelming that probably cost more than her family spent on groceries in a week. It's rude to ignore people when they're being friendly. Arya finally turned around, pressing her back against the cold metal of her locker, and found herself looking up at three faces that wore expressions ranging from predatory interest to cruel amusement. Brandon's blue eyes held the kind of entitlement that came from never being told no, while Tyler's grin revealed teeth that hadn't seen enough orthodontic care. Derek stood slightly behind them, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting he was ready to follow whatever lead the others set. "I'm sorry," Arya said quietly, clutching her chemistry textbook against her chest like armor. "I didn't realize you were talking to me." "Didn't realize?" Tyler laughed, a harsh sound that attracted glances from passing students, most of whom quickly looked away, unwilling to get involved. "We're standing right here. You deaf or just stupid?" The word hit her like a slap, and Arya felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. She'd heard worse, much worse, at her old school, but it never got easier. The casual cruelty of teenagers never ceased to amaze her, the way they could reduce another human being to nothing with just a few words. "I'm just trying to get to class," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Brandon reached out and plucked the chemistry book from her hands before she could react, holding it high above her head where she couldn't reach it. "What's the rush, sweetheart? We're just trying to welcome you to Jefferson High. Show a little gratitude." "Please give that back," Arya said, fighting to keep her voice steady. She could feel dozens of eyes on them now, students slowing their pace or stopping altogether to watch the drama unfold. Some looked sympathetic, but none stepped forward to help. This was the unspoken rule of high school survival. Don't get involved unless you want to become the next target. "Say please like you mean it," Brandon taunted, tossing the book to Tyler, who caught it with theatrical flair. "Maybe get on your knees and beg a little." The suggestion sent a ripple of uncomfortable laughter through their growing audience, and Arya felt something cold settle in her stomach. She'd seen this dynamic before, the way bullies fed off each other's energy, escalating their behavior to impress their friends and assert their dominance. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "The pack hunts together, little tiger, but remember, even the largest pack can be scattered by one who knows where to strike." "I asked politely," Arya said, straightening her spine and meeting Brandon's eyes directly for the first time. "Please return my book so I can go to class." There was something in her voice, a subtle shift in tone that Brandon didn't quite catch, but that made Derek take an unconscious step backward. Years of training had taught Arya to project confidence even when she felt afraid, to stand her ground even when every instinct screamed at her to run. Her grandfather had called it the way of the mountain, immovable, patient, but capable of devastating force when necessary. "Ooh, she's got some attitude after all," Tyler said, flipping through the chemistry book with exaggerated interest. "Look at this, guys. Honors chemistry. We got ourselves a little nerd here." "Nothing wrong with being smart," Brandon said with false magnanimity, "as long as you know your place. See, here at Jefferson, we have a social order. And new girls, especially quiet little Asian girls, start at the bottom. But don't worry, if you're real nice to us, maybe we'll let you work your way up." The racial undertone in his comment wasn't subtle, and Arya felt her jaw tighten. She'd dealt with this particular brand of ignorance before, the assumption that her ethnicity made her weak, submissive, an easy target. People looked at her mixed Japanese and Irish heritage and saw only what they expected to see, a small, quiet girl who wouldn't fight back. "My ethnicity has nothing to do with my place anywhere," Arya said, her voice carrying a warning that Brandon was too arrogant to heed. "And I'm not interested in your social order." Tyler whistled low. "Damn, Brandon, she's got some fight in her. Maybe we need to help her understand how things work around here." The hall had grown quieter now, other students sensing the escalating tension and either gathering to watch or hurrying past to avoid getting caught in whatever was about to happen. Near the far end of the corridor, Arya spotted a teacher, Ms. Rodriguez from the math department, but she was deep in conversation with another faculty member and seemed oblivious to the confrontation brewing just 50 feet away. Brandon stepped closer, invading Arya's personal space in a way that made her skin crawl. "You know what your problem is? You think you're special. But here's a news flash, sweetheart. You're not. You're just another scared little girl trying to get through high school without getting noticed. But guess what? We noticed you." He reached out and tugged on a strand of her hair, and Arya fought every instinct her grandfather had drilled into her to grab his wrist and twist until he dropped. But she'd made a promise to her parents when they'd moved here. No more fighting, no more incidents, no more visits from police officers or calls from school administrators. They'd been through enough, and she'd sworn to handle things differently this time. "Leave me alone," she said instead, pulling back from his touch. "I haven't done anything to you." "You exist," Tyler said with a cruel grin. "That's enough." The bell rang then, sharp and jarring in the tense atmosphere, and students began moving toward their classrooms with renewed urgency. Brandon glanced around, clearly frustrated that their entertainment was being cut short, and made a decision that would prove to be the first in a long series of mistakes. "This isn't over," he said, finally tossing her chemistry book back to her. Arya caught it reflexively, her reflexes faster than they should have been for someone who claimed to be just a quiet student. "We'll be seeing you around, new girl, real soon." As the three boys walked away, high-fiving each other and laughing about their introduction to the new student, Arya stood by her locker, feeling the familiar mixture of anger and resignation that had defined so much of her life. She'd hoped things would be different here, that she could just be a normal teenager worried about grades and college applications instead of constantly looking over her shoulder for the next attack. But as she watched Brandon Reeves swagger down the hallway like he owned the world, she realized that some things never changed. There were predators and prey in every ecosystem, and the hallways of high school were no different from any other jungle. The only question was which category you fell into. What Brandon and his friends didn't know, what nobody at Jefferson High knew, was that Arya Nakamura had been trained by one of the most feared martial artists in Japan before her family moved to the United States. Her grandfather, Kenji Nakamura, had been a legendary fighter who'd spent decades perfecting arts that most people only saw in movies. He'd been teaching Arya since she was 5 years old, recognizing in his quiet granddaughter a natural talent that appeared perhaps once in a generation. Under his patient guidance, she'd mastered not just karate and jujitsu, but also the more esoteric arts, Aikido for redirecting an opponent's energy, Krav Maga for real-world self-defense, and even some techniques from ancient samurai traditions that few people alive still practiced. Her small frame was deceptive. Beneath her oversized clothes was a body that had been conditioned to move with lethal precision, muscles trained to generate explosive power, and reflexes honed to respond faster than conscious thought. But her grandfather had also taught her restraint, the principle that true strength came from knowing when not to fight. "Violence is the last resort of the strong," he'd told her countless times, "and the first resort of the weak. A true warrior seeks to protect, not to dominate. So she'd learned to endure, to absorb the casual cruelties of teenagers who saw her silence as weakness rather than discipline. She'd perfected the art of being invisible, of moving through the world without attracting attention, of responding to provocation with quiet dignity, rather than the devastating counterattacks she was fully capable of delivering. Her first day at Jefferson High proceeded much as she'd expected. She navigated the confusing hallways with the help of her schedule and a small school map, sitting in the back of each classroom and speaking only when directly addressed by teachers. Her classmates eyed her with the typical mixture of curiosity and indifference reserved for new students, especially ones who seemed determined to blend into the background. In AP English, she listened to a discussion about the theme of justice in To Kill a Mockingbird, and thought about the irony of teenagers debating moral courage while completely ignoring the real-world bullying happening just outside their classroom doors. In calculus, she solved complex equations in her head while her teacher droned on about limits and derivatives, her mind sharp despite the anxiety that twisted in her stomach like a living thing. Lunch was the true test of any new student's survival skills, and Arya approached the cafeteria with the same strategic mindset her grandfather had taught her to apply to any potentially dangerous situation. She surveyed the room from the doorway, noting the established territories: jocks near the windows, theater kids by the stage area, academics clustered around tables near the library entrance. Each group had its own invisible boundaries, and crossing them uninvited could have social consequences that lasted for years. She bought a simple turkey sandwich and found an empty table near the back of the room, hoping to eat in peace while observing the complex social dynamics that played out around her. For 20 minutes, her strategy worked perfectly. She ate slowly, read a paperback novel she'd pulled from her backpack, and seemed to successfully avoid drawing any unwanted attention. But Brandon Reeves had been watching her all day, making mental notes about her schedule and habits the way a predator studies its prey. He'd spent his lunch period regaling his friends with exaggerated stories about their morning encounter, building up the narrative of the stuck-up new girl who needed to be taught a lesson about respect. "She thinks she's better than us," he told his table of followers, which had grown to include several other students eager to align themselves with someone they saw as powerful. "Walking around here like she owns the place, ignoring people, acting all mysterious and shit." "Maybe she's just shy," suggested Jessica Palmer, a sophomore who was dating one of Brandon's friends and often served as the voice of reason that nobody ever listened to. "Shy, my ass," Tyler interjected, still smarting from the way Arya had looked at him that morning, like he was something unpleasant she'd found on the bottom of her shoe. "You see the way she looked at us, like we were beneath her or something?" Derek, who'd been unusually quiet during lunch, finally spoke up. "Maybe we should just leave her alone. She's not bothering anybody." The table went silent for a moment, all eyes turning to Derek with expressions ranging from surprise to disappointment. Brandon's face darkened with anger, his blue eyes turning cold in a way that had intimidated countless students over the years. "You going soft on us, Chen?" Brandon asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Maybe you're forgetting what team you're on here." Derek's face flushed red, and he looked down at his uneaten pizza. He'd learned long ago that questioning Brandon's decisions was a quick way to find himself on the wrong side of the social divide, but something about targeting the new girl made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "I'm just saying, she hasn't done anything to us," Derek mumbled, but his voice lacked conviction. "She disrespected us," Brandon declared, his voice rising enough to draw glances from nearby tables. "And disrespect can't go unpunished, or pretty soon everyone thinks they can treat us like shit." It was a twisted logic, but one that made perfect sense within Brandon's worldview. He'd built his reputation on the fear and submission of others, and any crack in that foundation had to be addressed immediately and decisively. In his mind, allowing Arya to ignore him wasn't just a personal slight. It was a threat to the entire social order he'd worked years to establish. "So, what's the plan?" asked Mike Rodriguez, a junior who played football with Brandon and shared his talent for making other people's lives miserable. Brandon smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "We're going to help our new classmate understand how things work around here, starting this afternoon." As if sensing the negative attention focused on her, Arya looked up from her book and made brief eye contact with Brandon across the cafeteria. For just a moment, something passed between them. A recognition of the conflict that was brewing, the understanding that this was bigger than a simple misunderstanding between strangers. Brandon raised his plastic water bottle in a mock toast, his smile widening when Arya quickly looked away. He interpreted her averted gaze as fear, as submission, as proof that she was exactly what he'd thought, another weak target who could be intimidated into compliance. He had no idea how wrong he was. The afternoon proceeded without incident, though Arya was acutely aware of being watched as she moved between classes. She caught glimpses of Brandon and his friends in the hallways, noticed the way conversations stopped when she passed certain groups of students, felt the weight of hostile attention following her like a physical presence. In chemistry lab, she was paired with a quiet girl named Sarah Chen, Derek's younger sister, though Arya didn't know the connection yet. Sarah was a sophomore with an obvious talent for science and an equally obvious desire to avoid her brother's social circle. "You're the new girl," Sarah said as they measured chemicals for their assigned experiment. It wasn't a question. "Arya," she replied, grateful for the first neutral interaction she'd had all day. "Sarah, and I'm sorry about my brother's friends. She trailed off, searching for a diplomatic way to describe Brandon's crew. "Charming?" Arya suggested dryly, earning a small smile from Sarah. "That's one word for it. Just be careful around them, okay? They don't like it when people don't play their games." It was good advice, and Arya filed it away along with all the other information she'd gathered about Jefferson High's social landscape. But she also recognized the futility of trying to avoid conflict when someone was determined to create it. Brandon had marked her as a target, and no amount of careful behavior would change that fundamental fact. The final bell rang at 3:15, and Arya gathered her books with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Her parents wouldn't be home from work until after 6, which gave her several hours to explore her new neighborhood and maybe find a quiet place to practice the forms her grandfather had taught her. Physical exercise had always been her preferred method of dealing with stress, and today had certainly provided plenty of that. She made it to her locker without incident, but as she was organizing her books for the evening's homework assignments, she became aware of footsteps approaching from behind. Not the random noise of students heading home, but the deliberate sound of people moving with purpose. "Leaving so soon?" Brandon's voice held false surprise, as if her departure was somehow unexpected. "But we barely got to know each other today." Arya didn't turn around immediately, instead continuing to pack her backpack while her mind rapidly assessed the situation. The hallway was mostly empty now. Stragglers hurrying to catch buses or head to after-school activities, teachers locked away in their classrooms grading papers or preparing for the next day. No witnesses, no authority figures, no one who might intervene if things escalated. When she finally turned around, she found not just Brandon, Tyler, and Derek, but 2 additional boys she didn't recognize. The message was clear. This wasn't going to be another brief verbal confrontation. They'd brought reinforcements, and they were confident enough in their numerical advantage to escalate things beyond words. "I'm just going home," Arya said calmly, slinging her backpack over one shoulder. "I don't want any trouble." "But trouble wants you," Tyler said with a grin that revealed his slightly crooked teeth. "See, we've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and we realized we might have given you the wrong impression about how things work around here." The two new additions to their group were juniors, Marcus Webb, a tall black student who played basketball and had fallen into Brandon's orbit because he mistakenly thought it would help his social status, and Joey Castellano, a stocky Italian-American kid whose father owned a construction company and who'd inherited both his father's temper and his tendency to solve problems with violence. "Maybe we should do this somewhere more private," Derek suggested, glancing nervously at the handful of students still visible at the far end of the hallway. "Good thinking," Brandon agreed. "New girl, you're coming with us for a little orientation session." "I don't think so," Arya replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her system. "I'm going home." She started to walk away, but Marcus stepped sideways to block her path, his size and athletic build making the threat implicit. "Brandon asked you nicely. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Arya stopped walking and looked up at Marcus, her dark eyes holding his gaze with an intensity that made him slightly uncomfortable. "You don't want to do this," she said quietly. "Any of you." The warning in her voice was subtle but unmistakable, at least to someone trained to recognize such things. But these were teenage boys drunk on their own perceived power, too young and too stupid to recognize the difference between prey and predator when the predator was disguised as something small and harmless. "Is that a threat?" Joey asked, cracking his knuckles with theatrical menace. "You threatening us, new girl?" "I'm giving you advice," Arya replied. "There's a difference." Brandon laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the metal lockers. "You hear that, guys? She's giving us advice. How thoughtful." His expression turned ugly. "Here's some advice for you, sweetheart. Shut your mouth and do what you're told." They began moving as a group, herding her toward a side corridor that led to the older section of the building where maintenance stored supplies and held the heating equipment. It was an area most students avoided, poorly lit and largely forgotten, except by those who needed privacy for activities that wouldn't be tolerated in more visible areas of the school. Arya allowed herself to be guided, her mind racing through possibilities and contingencies. Her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the best strategy was to let your opponent think they had the advantage, to allow them to commit to a course of action that would ultimately work against them. "Patience, little tiger," his voice whispered in her memory. "Let them reveal their intentions before you reveal your capabilities." The maintenance corridor was exactly as she'd expected, dimly lit, lined with supply closets and electrical panels, with a concrete floor that would provide excellent traction for the kind of precise footwork she might need to employ. More importantly, it was isolated enough that any sounds from their orientation session wouldn't be overheard by passing teachers or students. "Much better," Brandon said, his voice taking on a predatory quality that made Arya's skin crawl. "Now we can have a proper conversation without any interruptions." "What exactly do you want?" Arya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Respect," Tyler said immediately. "An apology for the way you acted this morning. And maybe a little demonstration that you understand your place here," Joey added, stepping closer with the confidence of someone who'd never had his assumptions about physical dominance challenged. Derek remained notably silent, standing slightly apart from the group with an expression that suggested he was already regretting his involvement in whatever was about to happen. But he made no move to leave, no attempt to diffuse the situation, a passive complicity that was almost worse than active participation. "My place?" Arya repeated, genuine curiosity in her voice. "And where exactly do you think that is?" "Wherever we tell you it is," Brandon said, his blue eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "See, here's how it works at Jefferson High. The strong do what they want, and the weak do what they're told. And you, sweetheart, are definitely in the weak category." As if to emphasize his point, he reached out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to be painful for someone without her conditioning. Arya felt her grandfather's training kick in, the automatic assessment of angles and leverage, the calculation of force vectors and vulnerable points. But she forced herself to remain still. "Let go of me," she said, her voice carrying a warning that Brandon was too arrogant to heed. "Or what?" he taunted, tightening his grip. "You'll call for help? Scream? Cry?" He leaned closer, his breath hot against her face. "Nobody's coming to save you, new girl. It's just us down here." Marcus and Joey had positioned themselves to block both exits from the corridor, while Tyler stood to Brandon's left with his phone out, apparently recording the encounter for later entertainment. Derek remained against the far wall, his face pale, but his feet firmly planted. "You know what your real problem is?" Brandon continued, his grip on her wrist now painful enough to leave bruises on someone without Arya's conditioning. "You think you're special, but I can tell just by looking at you, you're nothing. Just another scared little girl pretending to be tough." He reached out with his free hand and grabbed her other wrist, pulling her closer until she could smell the testosterone and cheap body spray that seemed to emanate from his pores like a personal cologne. "But don't worry, we're going to help you figure out exactly what you're good for." The implication in his words was unmistakable, and Arya felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. This had moved beyond simple bullying into something much darker, and she realized that her promise to her parents about avoiding violence might be impossible to keep. "Let me go," she said again, but this time her voice carried a different quality, harder, more controlled, with undertones that spoke of consequences rather than pleading. "I don't think so," Brandon replied, his hands sliding down to grab her by the hips, pulling her against him in a way that left no doubt about his intentions. "I think it's time you learned what happens to girls who think they're too good for—" He never finished the sentence. In one fluid motion that was too fast for the human eye to fully track, Arya twisted her left wrist in a way that broke Brandon's grip, using his own thumb as leverage against him, simultaneously driving her right elbow backward into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. As he doubled over, gasping for air that wouldn't come, she spun and delivered a precise strike to a pressure point just below his left ear that sent him crashing into the nearest locker with a sound like thunder. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. For a moment, the corridor was silent except for Brandon's labored breathing as he slumped against the lockers, his eyes wide with shock and pain. His friends stood frozen, their brains struggling to process what they'd just witnessed. The quiet new girl they'd been planning to terrorize had just dismantled their leader with a casual efficiency that spoke of years of training. "Holy shit," Tyler whispered, his phone forgotten in his hand. "How did she—" Marcus recovered first, his athletic training overriding his shock as he lunged forward with surprising speed. But Arya was already moving, sidestepping his charge and using his momentum against him with a hip throw that sent him crashing into a supply cart, scattering cleaning supplies across the concrete floor. Joey came next, swinging wild haymaker punches with the desperate fury of someone who'd realized he was in over his head. Arya ducked under his first swing, trapped his extended arm, and used a basic Aikido technique to send him spinning into the wall with enough force to rattle the electrical panel mounted there. Derek, to his credit, had the intelligence to recognize that this situation had spiraled completely out of control. Instead of attacking, he raised his hands in surrender. "I'm out," he said quickly. "I'm not part of this." Arya nodded once, acknowledging his surrender, before turning her attention back to Tyler, who was still standing in the same spot with his mouth hanging open. "You can leave," she told him calmly. "All of you can leave." But Brandon, despite his injuries, wasn't ready to accept defeat. Pride and humiliation warred in his chest as he pushed himself off the lockers, his face flushed red with anger and embarrassment. No girl, especially not some quiet little Asian girl, was going to make him look weak in front of his friends. "You fucking bitch," he snarled, pulling a folding knife from his pocket with shaking hands. "You think you're tough? Let's see how tough you are now." The appearance of the weapon changed everything. What had been a schoolyard confrontation was now something much more serious, and Arya felt her grandfather's training shift into a different mode, one designed not for teaching lessons, but for survival. "Put the knife away," she said, her voice deadly calm. "Walk away now, and this ends here." "Like hell," Brandon spat, advancing with the knife held awkwardly in front of him. He'd seen weapons used in movies, but had no real training in how to actually fight with the blade, which made him more dangerous rather than less, unpredictable and likely to hurt himself as much as anyone else. Tyler had finally remembered he was holding a phone and was frantically trying to call 911, but his hands were shaking so badly he kept hitting the wrong numbers. Marcus was groaning on the floor, clutching his shoulder where he'd hit the supply cart, while Joey was slowly sliding down the wall, his eyes unfocused and his movements uncoordinated. Derek had pressed himself against the far wall, his face pale with terror. "Brandon, man, just stop," he pleaded. "This is crazy. Put the knife away before someone gets really hurt." But Brandon was beyond rational thought now, his pride and reputation on the line in a way that made him desperate. He lunged forward with the knife, aiming for Arya's midsection in a clumsy overhand stab that would have been easily avoided even by someone with minimal training. Arya moved like water, flowing around his attack and catching his wrist in an iron grip that stopped his momentum cold. For a moment they stood frozen like that, Brandon's knife hand trapped just inches from her body, his eyes wide with the sudden realization that he was completely outmatched. "Drop it," Arya said, applying just enough pressure to the nerve cluster in his wrist to send shooting pain up his arm. The knife clattered to the concrete floor, and Arya kicked it away with a casual motion before releasing Brandon's wrist. He stumbled backward, cradling his hand against his chest, his face a mixture of pain and humiliation. "This is over," Arya announced to the group, her voice carrying absolute authority. "All of you are going to walk away, and we're never going to have this conversation again." Tyler had finally managed to dial 911, but Derek quickly grabbed the phone away from him. "What are you doing, man? You want to explain to the cops why we cornered the new girl in an empty hallway?" "She attacked us," Tyler protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "With what?" Derek shot back. "Your own video probably shows Brandon grabbing her first, and who's going to believe that one girl beat up 4 guys unless she had a damn good reason?" The truth of this statement began to penetrate Tyler's panic-clouded mind. They'd initiated the confrontation. They'd brought her to an isolated location, and Brandon had drawn a weapon. Any objective investigation would conclude that Arya had acted in self-defense, while they would be facing charges for assault, false imprisonment, and weapons violations. "We need to get out of here," Derek said urgently. "All of us, before someone comes looking." Marcus had managed to get to his feet, though he was obviously hurt and would likely need medical attention for his shoulder. Joey was conscious but disoriented, blood trickling from his nose where he'd hit the wall. Brandon was still clutching his wrist, his face pale with pain and shock. "This isn't over," Brandon said through gritted teeth as Derek and Tyler helped him stand. "You think you're hot shit now, but this isn't over." Arya looked at him with something approaching pity. "Yes, it is," she said simply, "because if you ever try something like this again, I won't be so gentle." The casual way she delivered the threat, as if beating 4 teenage boys was considered gentle by her standards, sent a chill through the group that had nothing to do with the school's inadequate heating system. They left quickly, supporting each other and whispering urgently about their injuries and what story they would tell if anyone asked questions. Derek lingered for a moment at the corridor entrance, looking back at Arya with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this." "But it did happen," Arya replied. "And now you have to decide what kind of person you want to be going forward." Derek nodded once and hurried after his friends, leaving Arya alone in the maintenance corridor with the scattered cleaning supplies and the lingering scent of teenage fear. She took a deep breath, centering herself the way her grandfather had taught her, and began the process of returning her body and mind to a state of calm. The confrontation had lasted less than 5 minutes, but she knew its effects would ripple through Jefferson High for weeks or months to come. Word would spread, it always did in a school this size, and her carefully maintained anonymity was now impossible to preserve. But as she gathered her backpack and headed for the exit, Arya found that she wasn't particularly bothered by this development. She'd spent years trying to be invisible, trying to avoid conflict, trying to be the kind of quiet, unassuming student who graduated without leaving any impression at all. Maybe it was time to try a different approach. The next morning arrived grey and drizzly, with the kind of persistent autumn rain that made everything seem slightly miserable. Arya dressed carefully in dark jeans and a fitted black sweater that, unlike her usual oversized clothes, actually revealed the compact strength of her athletic build. She'd spent the evening before in meditation and practice, centering herself for whatever social fallout might result from yesterday's confrontation. Her parents had already left for work when she came downstairs, leaving only a note on the kitchen counter reminding her to lock the door and have a good day at school. They still had no idea that their quiet, studious daughter had hospitalized 3 students at her previous school after they'd cornered her in a similar situation, or that the mutual decision to transfer had actually been a barely disguised ultimatum from administrators who were terrified of the legal ramifications. The ride to school on the city bus was uneventful, though Arya noticed several students from Jefferson High whispering and pointing in her direction. Word was clearly spreading about yesterday's incident, though she wondered how accurate the various versions of the story would prove to be. High school rumors had a tendency to mutate as they spread, growing more dramatic with each retelling. She entered the school through the main doors and immediately sensed the difference in atmosphere. Conversations stopped when she passed. Students stepped aside to give her more room in the hallways, and she caught more than one person discreetly taking photos with their phones. The anonymity she'd cultivated so carefully for years was now completely destroyed. At her locker, she found a small group of students gathered nearby, not threatening, but clearly curious about the girl who'd somehow managed to single-handedly defeat Jefferson High's most notorious bullies. Among them was Sarah Chen, who approached with the kind of cautious respect usually reserved for dangerous animals. "Is it true?" Sarah asked without preamble. "Did you really kick the shit out of Brandon Reeves and his whole crew?" Arya considered her answer carefully. The truth was that she'd used minimal force to neutralize a threat, but she doubted that nuance would translate well to the high school rumor mill. "They tried to intimidate me," she said finally. "I defended myself." "Derek won't say what happened," Sarah continued, "but he came home last night looking like he'd seen a ghost. And Marcus Webb is wearing a sling today, walking around like he's afraid to make eye contact with anyone." This was news to Arya, though not particularly surprising. She'd felt Marcus's shoulder separate when he hit the supply cart, and that kind of injury would require medical attention and possibly physical therapy. She wondered what story he'd told his parents and doctors about how it happened. "Where's Brandon?" Arya asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Absent," Sarah replied with obvious satisfaction. "First time in 3 years he's missed school when he wasn't suspended. Word is, he's got his wrist in a cast and a black eye that makeup can't cover." The information about the black eye was puzzling, since Arya hadn't struck Brandon in the face during their confrontation. But then she remembered the way he'd bounced off the lockers after her elbow strike, and realized he'd probably hit the metal hard enough to leave marks. "Tyler's here. But he looks like he's about to throw up every time someone mentions your name, Sarah added with gleeful malice. And Joey Castellano keeps rubbing his head like he's got the world's worst headache. Arya nodded absently, her mind already moving on to more pressing concerns. Brandon's absence was temporary. His pride and his reputation would demand that he return and attempt to reassert his dominance. And when he did, he'd likely be even more dangerous than before, desperate to prove that yesterday had been a fluke. "You should be careful," Sarah said, apparently reading her thoughts. "Brandon's not the type to let something like this go. And his dad has connections. Police, school board, city council. They might try to get you expelled or arrested or something." It was good advice, and Arya appreciated the warning. But she'd dealt with similar situations before, and she knew that administrative retaliation was just another form of bullying, one that could be handled with the right combination of preparation and strategic thinking. "Thanks for the heads up," Arya said, closing her locker and shouldering her backpack. "I'll keep that in mind." As she walked toward her first class, Arya was acutely aware of the attention focused on her from every direction. Some students looked impressed, others frightened, still others curious about the quiet girl who'd apparently revealed hidden depths of violence. But underneath all the various reactions was a common thread of respect, the kind that came from recognizing someone who couldn't be pushed around. In AP English, Mrs. Patterson was discussing the theme of justice in literature, apparently oblivious to the real-world drama playing out among her students. "Can anyone give me an example of a character who seeks justice through violence?" she asked the class. Several hands went up, but Arya noticed that many students were looking in her direction rather than at the teacher. The parallel between fictional revenge stories and her own situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Hamlet," suggested Jennifer Walsh, a senior who'd always struck Arya as particularly insightful. "He spends the whole play trying to avenge his father's murder." "Good example," Mrs. Patterson agreed. "But what about the consequences of his actions? Does Hamlet's quest for justice ultimately succeed?" "Everyone dies," pointed out Marcus Thompson, a quiet boy who rarely spoke in class. "Sometimes justice costs more than it's worth." The discussion continued, but Arya found her attention drifting to the larger questions raised by yesterday's confrontation. She'd defended herself successfully, but what would be the long-term consequences? Would Brandon escalate to more serious violence? Would other students see her as a target to test themselves against? Had she traded one set of problems for another? Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "Violence is a tool, little tiger, nothing more. Like any tool, its value depends on how and when it is used. But remember, once you draw a sword, it must taste blood before it can be sheathed again." She'd hoped that yesterday's demonstration would be enough to discourage further aggression, but experience had taught her that bullies rarely accepted defeat gracefully. More likely, Brandon was already planning his next move, looking for a way to reassert his dominance while avoiding the kind of direct confrontation that had proven so disastrous for him. The morning passed without incident, though Arya remained hyper-aware of her surroundings and the people around her. In calculus, she noticed Derek Chen sitting 3 rows ahead of her, his posture tense and his attention clearly divided between the lesson on derivatives and frequent nervous glances in her direction. During the break between classes, he finally approached her in the hallway, his face pale but determined. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Arya nodded and followed him to a less crowded section of the corridor, curious about what Derek might have to say. Of all of Brandon's friends, he'd been the least aggressive during yesterday's confrontation, and his decision to stop Tyler from calling the police suggested a practical intelligence that the others lacked. "I wanted to apologize," Derek began, his words coming out in a rush. "For yesterday, for my part in what happened. It was wrong, and I knew it was wrong, but He trailed off, struggling to find words for the complex mixture of peer pressure, cowardice and social survival that had led him to participate in cornering her. "But you went along with it anyway," Arya finished for him. Derek nodded miserably. "I was afraid that if I didn't, they'd turn on me next. Brandon doesn't tolerate dissent, and I've seen what happens to people who cross him." "And now you've seen what happens to people who follow him," Arya pointed out. "Yeah." Derek rubbed his shoulder unconsciously, though he hadn't been physically injured in the confrontation. "Listen, I know you don't have any reason to trust me, but I wanted to warn you about something. Brandon's planning something for lunch today. I don't know exactly what, but he's been making calls all morning, bringing in people from outside school." This was concerning news, though not entirely unexpected. Brandon's absence from school meant he was free to organize a response without the constraints of teacher supervision or administrative oversight. And if he was recruiting people from outside Jefferson High, it suggested he was escalating far beyond typical teenage bullying. "How many people?" Arya asked. "I don't know for sure, but I heard him mention at least 6 or 7 names. Some of them are his older brother's friends, college guys who don't have anything to lose by getting into a fight with a high school student." The information painted a troubling picture. Arya was confident in her ability to handle multiple attackers, but Brandon was clearly learning from his mistakes and adapting his tactics. A larger group, possibly including adults, would present challenges that required different strategies than yesterday's confrontation. "Why are you telling me this?" Arya asked. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor tiles with obvious discomfort. "Because I'm tired of being afraid," he said finally. "I've spent 3 years watching Brandon and his friends make other people miserable, and I told myself it was okay as long as I wasn't the target. But yesterday, seeing what almost happened to you, realizing how close we came to—" He shook his head. "I can't be part of that anymore." It was a moment of moral clarity that Arya respected, even if it had come too late to prevent yesterday's incident. "What will you do?" she asked. "I'm going to tell my parents what's been going on. Maybe transfer schools. Maybe just stay away from Brandon's crowd. I don't know yet." Derek looked up at her with something approaching admiration. "But I wanted you to know that not everyone at Jefferson High is your enemy." "I appreciate the warning," Arya said, and meant it. "And Derek, making the right choice now doesn't erase yesterday, but it's still the right choice." He nodded and walked away, leaving Arya to consider the implications of what she'd learned. Brandon was escalating the conflict, bringing in reinforcements, and apparently planning some kind of public confrontation during lunch. The smart move would be to skip lunch entirely, maybe even leave school early to avoid whatever trap he was setting. But running away would only delay the inevitable. Brandon's pride had been wounded, and he wouldn't stop until he'd found a way to reassert his dominance. Better to face whatever he was planning on her own terms, rather than spend the next weeks or months looking over her shoulder. Besides, her grandfather had taught her that sometimes the best defense was a strategic offense. If Brandon wanted a public confrontation, she could give him one, just not the kind he was expecting. The rest of the morning passed with agonizing slowness, each class period feeling like an hour as Arya's mind raced through possible scenarios and countermeasures. She noted which students seemed to be aware of the brewing conflict and which appeared genuinely oblivious. She memorized the layout of the cafeteria from her brief visit the day before, identifying potential advantages and obstacles. Most importantly, she mentally prepared herself for the possibility that this confrontation might cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed. When the lunch bell finally rang, Arya made her way to the cafeteria with the measured pace of someone walking to their execution. The large room was more crowded than usual, filled not just with students, but with several older teenagers and young adults who clearly didn't belong on campus. They'd positioned themselves strategically around the room, near the exits, by the serving line, close to the tables where Brandon's usual crowd gathered. Brandon himself was sitting at his regular table, his right wrist encased in a bright blue cast, and his left eye surrounded by a spectacular bruise that makeup couldn't completely conceal. Despite his injuries, he was clearly in his element, holding court like a general preparing for battle, his voice animated as he gestured with his uninjured hand. The moment Arya entered the cafeteria, the noise level dropped noticeably as conversations stopped and heads turned in her direction. She felt like a gunfighter walking into a saloon, every eye in the room tracking her movement as she made her way toward the serving line. She bought the same simple turkey sandwich as yesterday, paid with exact change, and found an empty table near the center of the room, deliberately choosing a position that would be visible from every angle rather than trying to hide in the back. If Brandon wanted a public spectacle, she would give him one, but on her terms. For several minutes, nothing happened. Students ate their lunches and carried on whispered conversations, the tension in the room building like pressure in a sealed container. Arya ate methodically, outwardly calm, but internally cataloging every detail of her surroundings, the distance to each exit, the position of potential allies and enemies, the location of anything that could be used as a weapon if necessary. Then Brandon stood up. The simple action seemed to serve as a signal, because suddenly his entire table was rising as well, followed by the older teenagers positioned around the room. They began moving toward Arya's table with the coordinated precision of a pack hunt, cutting off escape routes and forming a loose circle that expanded to encompass not just her, but several nearby tables of innocent students. "Well, well," Brandon said as he approached, his voice pitched to carry across the entire cafeteria. "Look who decided to show up for lunch today. How thoughtful of our new friend to join us." His tone was casual, almost friendly, but the menace underneath was unmistakable. This was a predator who'd learned from his mistakes, who'd brought overwhelming force to bear on what he saw as a problem that needed to be solved permanently. "Brandon," Arya acknowledged, not bothering to stand up, "I see you brought friends." "Just some guys who wanted to meet the famous new girl," Brandon replied with false magnanimity. "You know how it is. Word gets around when someone does something impressive." One of the older teenagers, a college-aged kid with the kind of aggressive swagger that screamed "peaked in high school," cracked his knuckles loudly. "So this is the little bitch who thinks she can fight?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "She doesn't look like much." "Appearances can be deceiving," Arya said mildly, taking another bite of her sandwich. Her outward calm was having the desired effect. Several of Brandon's reinforcements looked uncertain, clearly expecting her to show fear or attempt to flee. "You know what I think?" Brandon continued, beginning to pace around her table like a shark circling wounded prey. "I think yesterday was just a lucky shot. I think you caught us off guard, and now you're acting tough because you know you can't do it again." "That's certainly one theory," Arya agreed. Her refusal to take the bait was clearly frustrating Brandon, who'd expected her to either back down or escalate the confrontation herself. Instead, she sat calmly eating her lunch while surrounded by nearly a dozen hostile teenagers and young adults, displaying the kind of composure that suggested either supreme confidence or complete insanity. "So here's what's going to happen," Brandon announced, his voice rising to ensure everyone in the cafeteria could hear him clearly. "You're going to apologize, publicly, for the unprovoked attack yesterday, for disrespecting me and my friends, for thinking you're something special when you're just another scared little girl." "And if I don't?" Arya asked, though she already knew the answer. Brandon's smile was ugly and predatory. "Then my friends and I are going to teach you some manners. Right here, right now, in front of everyone." The threat was clear, and the cafeteria had fallen completely silent now, every student recognizing that they were about to witness something that would be talked about for years. Some had their phones out, ready to record whatever happened next. Others were edging toward the exits, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of whatever was about to unfold. Arya finished her sandwich, wiped her hands on a napkin, and finally stood up to face Brandon directly. The movement was smooth and controlled, without any of the nervous energy that might be expected from someone facing overwhelming odds. "I'm not going to apologize," she said clearly, her voice carrying easily across the silent cafeteria. "Not for defending myself, and not for showing everyone what you really are underneath all the bluster and intimidation." Brandon's face flushed red with anger, his injured pride demanding satisfaction that words couldn't provide. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," he snarled, gesturing to his assembled crew. "Show her what happens to bitches who don't know their place." The attack came from multiple directions simultaneously, as Brandon's strategy had apparently learned from yesterday's mistakes. But if he'd hoped that overwhelming numbers would compensate for individual skill, he was about to be educated in the fundamental differences between a mob and a coordinated fighting force. The first attacker was the college kid who'd called her a bitch, a tall, muscular young man who'd probably never been in a real fight, but had seen enough UFC to think he understood violence. He charged at Arya with his arms spread wide, apparently planning to tackle her to the ground, where his size advantage would be decisive. Arya stepped into his charge rather than away from it, using his momentum against him with a perfectly executed hip throw that sent him sailing over her shoulder to crash into a nearby table with enough force to scatter lunch trays and send food flying across the floor. Before the sound of his impact had faded, she was already moving again, flowing between two more attackers with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years learning to fight multiple opponents. Her elbow found Tyler's solar plexus with surgical precision, doubling him over and removing him from the fight before he could throw a single punch. A third attacker, one of Brandon's brother's friends, managed to grab her from behind, wrapping his arms around her torso in what might have been an effective restraint against someone without her training. But Arya simply dropped her weight and drove her head backward into his nose, with a sharp crack that sent blood spattering across the cafeteria floor. The entire sequence had taken perhaps 10 seconds, and already 3 of Brandon's reinforcements were down and out of the fight. The rest hesitated, suddenly realizing that their numerical advantage might not be as decisive as they'd assumed. "What the fuck are you waiting for?" Brandon screamed at his remaining allies, his voice cracking with panic and rage. "She's just one girl." But even as he spoke, Arya was proving him wrong. She moved through the remaining attackers like a scythe through wheat, each technique flowing seamlessly into the next with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of thousands of hours of training. A precise strike to a nerve cluster dropped Joey Castellano for the second day in a row. A perfectly timed sweep sent Marcus Webb's replacement crashing into the soda machine with a sound like thunder. Within 30 seconds of the first attack, the only people left standing were Arya, Brandon, and a handful of his friends, who'd wisely decided that discretion was the better part of valor. The cafeteria erupted into chaos as students scrambled to get away from the violence, phones came out to record the aftermath, and someone finally had the presence of mind to run for help. But Arya's attention was focused entirely on Brandon, who stood frozen in the middle of the destruction with his mouth hanging open in shock. "Your turn," she said simply, taking a step toward him. Brandon stumbled backward, his earlier bravado completely evaporated in the face of the overwhelming evidence of her capabilities. "Stay away from me," he stammered, raising his cast-encased hand as if it could somehow protect him. "I'll call the police. I'll have you arrested." "For what?" Arya asked, continuing her slow advance. "Self-defense. You attacked me, Brandon, in front of 300 witnesses, with a dozen friends. Who do you think the police are going to believe?" The truth of this statement was written on Brandon's face as the reality of his situation finally penetrated his panic. He'd initiated the confrontation, brought in outside reinforcements, and done it all in the most public way possible. Any investigation would conclude that Arya had acted in self-defense against overwhelming odds. "This isn't over," Brandon said desperately, but his voice lacked any conviction. Your father will do nothing," Arya interrupted, her voice carrying absolute certainty. "Because if you or anyone else tries something like this again, I won't stop at just defending myself. I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person you really are." She reached into her backpack and pulled out a small digital recorder, holding it up where Brandon could see it clearly. "Did you really think I'd walk into this without being prepared? I've got every word of your threats, every detail of your plan to have multiple people assault a single girl. How do you think that's going to play on the evening news?" Brandon's face went pale as the implications sank in. In his rage and need for revenge, he'd given her all the evidence she'd need to destroy not just his reputation, but potentially his future. Assault charges, conspiracy, bringing unauthorized adults onto school property. The legal ramifications could follow him for years. "What do you want?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the chaos still erupting around them. "I want you to leave me alone," Arya said simply. "I want you to stop terrorizing other students, and I want you to understand that if you ever try something like this again, the consequences will be much worse than a few bruises and a broken wrist." Before Brandon could respond, the cafeteria doors burst open as school security guards and administrators flooded into the room, followed closely by several police officers who'd apparently been called when the fight began. Principal Matthews surveyed the scene with the expression of a man watching his career prospects evaporate in real time. "What the hell happened here?" he demanded, though the evidence was fairly clear. Several teenagers and young adults were scattered around the cafeteria in various states of injury and consciousness, while Arya stood calmly in the center of it all without so much as a torn sleeve. "She attacked us," Brandon said immediately, pointing at Arya with his uninjured hand. "She's some kind of psycho. She just started fighting everyone for no reason." "Is that so?" Principal Matthews asked, his skeptical tone suggesting he wasn't buying Brandon's version of events. "Actually," said a voice from behind them, "I recorded the whole thing." Everyone turned to see Sarah Chen standing near the entrance with her phone held up, her face flushed with excitement and moral indignation. "It's all here. Brandon threatening her, bringing in those college guys, demanding that she apologize or they'd teach her a lesson. She didn't throw the first punch. She didn't even stand up until they surrounded her." "Delete that," Brandon demanded, starting towards Sarah with murderous intent, but one of the police officers stepped between them. "I don't think so, son," the officer said calmly. "That recording is evidence now." Over the next hour, as paramedics treated the injured and police took statements from witnesses, the truth of what had happened became impossible to deny. Brandon had organized a premeditated assault using outside reinforcements. Arya had defended herself against overwhelming odds, and the entire incident had been captured on multiple phones from different angles. The college students were arrested for assault and trespassing. Tyler and Joey were suspended, pending a disciplinary hearing. Derek, who'd refused to participate and had actually tried to warn other students away from the confrontation, was given a week's detention for his involvement in yesterday's incident, but nothing more. Brandon himself faced the most serious consequences. In addition to suspension and possible expulsion, he was looking at criminal charges for conspiracy to commit assault, bringing unauthorized adults onto school property, and making terroristic threats. His father's political connections might help him avoid jail time, but his reputation and his future were effectively destroyed. "Miss Nakamura," Principal Matthews said, as the chaos finally began to die down, "I'll need you to come to my office to give a complete statement." "Of course," Arya agreed, "but I should probably call my parents first." "Already done," the principal replied. "They're on their way." As they walked toward the administrative offices, Principal Matthews glanced at Arya with something approaching awe. "Where did you learn to fight like that?" he asked. My grandfather, Arya replied simply. He believed that everyone should know how to defend themselves. He must have been quite a teacher. Arya thought about the years of training, the countless hours of practice, the patient instruction in not just technique, but philosophy and restraint. He was, she said quietly. He taught me that true strength comes from protecting others, not dominating them. Well, Principal Matthews said as they reached his office, I think Jefferson High just learned that lesson the hard way. The aftermath of what the local media dubbed the cafeteria incident rippled through Jefferson High School like an earthquake, fundamentally altering the social landscape in ways that would be felt for years to come. Within hours, video footage of the confrontation had spread across social media platforms, turning Arya from an unknown transfer student into something approaching a local legend. The immediate consequences were swift and decisive. Brandon Reeves was expelled from Jefferson High and faced criminal charges that would likely result in probation and community service, assuming his father's lawyers could keep him out of juvenile detention. His college applications were withdrawn, his athletic scholarships revoked, and his carefully constructed image as a future leader crumbled into dust. Tyler Morrison and Joey Castellano received suspensions that would remain on their permanent records, making their own college prospects significantly more challenging. The college students who'd participated in the assault faced adult charges that could impact their futures in ways they were only beginning to understand. But the changes went far beyond simple punishment for the perpetrators. Students who'd spent years walking in fear of Brandon and his crew suddenly found themselves able to move through the hallways without constantly looking over their shoulders. The culture of intimidation that had dominated Jefferson High for years began to crumble as other potential bullies realized that their victims might not be as helpless as they'd assumed. Arya herself found her carefully maintained anonymity completely destroyed, but in ways she hadn't expected. Instead of becoming a pariah, she discovered that many students viewed her as something between a hero and a guardian angel. Stories spread about her grandfather's legendary fighting skills, her own mysterious background, and the philosophical principles that guided her actions. "You should have seen it," Sarah Chen told her sister excitedly during dinner the night after the incident. "There were like 12 guys, and she just moved through them like they weren't even there. But the crazy part is, she didn't really hurt anyone, not permanently, I mean. She could have killed them all if she'd wanted to, but she just neutralized them." Derek, meanwhile, had made good on his promise to distance himself from his former friends. He'd transferred to AP classes where Brandon's influence was minimal, begun volunteering at a local community center that helped victims of bullying, and slowly started building relationships based on shared interests rather than social survival. "I keep thinking about what might have happened if you hadn't been able to defend yourself," he told Arya during one of their occasional conversations. "If you'd just been a normal girl in that situation." The thought was disturbing enough that Derek had started speaking out against bullying in ways that surprised even himself, becoming an unexpected advocate for students who couldn't protect themselves the way Arya had. For Arya, the weeks following the incident brought a different kind of challenge than she'd faced before. Instead of trying to remain invisible, she now had to navigate a social landscape where she was simultaneously respected and feared, sought out by some students and avoided by others who weren't sure how to interact with someone whose capabilities so clearly exceeded normal teenage expectations. Teachers treated her with a mixture of gratitude and wariness, appreciating that the school's bullying problem had been dramatically reduced, but uncertain about how to handle a student whose methods, while effective, existed outside the normal channels of administrative justice. "The school board is still debating whether to commend you or discipline you," Principal Matthews told her during one of their regular meetings. "Technically, fighting on school property is grounds for suspension, but given the circumstances—" "I understand," Arya replied. "I never wanted any of this to happen. I just wanted to finish high school without any drama. Well, Principal Matthews said with a rueful smile, I think it's safe to say that ship has sailed. The media attention eventually died down, as it always does, but the changes at Jefferson High proved more lasting. Students began standing up for each other in ways they never had before, inspired by Arya's example, but also by the realization that bullies weren't as powerful as they'd seemed. The school's administration, embarrassed by how badly they'd failed to address the bullying problem, implemented new policies and training programs designed to identify and address harassment before it escalated to violence. Arya's relationship with her parents evolved as well, as the full truth about her capabilities and her past incidents finally came to light. Instead of anger or disappointment, she found understanding and a deeper appreciation for the principles her grandfather had tried to instill in her. He always said you were special, her mother told her during one of their long conversations about the family's martial arts legacy. But I think we underestimated just how special he meant. As spring approached and graduation drew nearer, Arya began to see the broader implications of what had happened at Jefferson High. She'd successfully defended herself and others, but more importantly, she demonstrated that the cycle of intimidation and fear that plagued so many schools wasn't inevitable. With the right combination of courage, skill, and moral conviction, even the most entrenched patterns of abuse could be broken. Her grandfather had been right about the nature of true strength. It wasn't about dominating others or proving superiority through violence. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, standing up to injustice even when it was dangerous to do so, and having the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when it wasn't. The bullies of Jefferson High had learned that lesson the hard way, but they had learned it. And in the end, that education might prove more valuable than any traditional academic curriculum in preparing them for the challenges of adult life. But the story of what happened at Jefferson High was far from over. In the days and weeks that followed the cafeteria incident, Arya discovered that her actions had set in motion changes that would ripple through the school community in ways she never could have anticipated. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came just 3 days after Brandon's expulsion, when a freshman named Michael Torres approached her in the library. Michael was small for his age, with thick glasses and the kind of nervous energy that seemed to scream target to every predator in the building. Under the old regime, he would have been prime meat for Brandon's crew and their imitators. "Excuse me," Michael said quietly, sliding into the chair across from Arya at her usual study table. "Are you Arya Nakamura?" Arya looked up from her calculus homework, noting the way Michael's hands trembled slightly as he clutched a worn paperback copy of Ender's Game. "Yes," she said simply, waiting to see what he wanted. "I just wanted to say thank you," Michael continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "for what you did. Brandon and his friends, they used to, well, they made my life pretty miserable. But ever since..." He trailed off, apparently struggling to find the right words. "Ever since what?" Arya prompted gently. "Ever since you showed everyone that they weren't as tough as they pretended to be. Things have been different. People aren't as afraid anymore, and some of the other bullies, they've been a lot quieter lately." It was true, Arya had noticed. The hallways felt different now, less tense, less charged with the undercurrent of fear that had seemed to permeate every interaction. Students walked with straighter spines, made eye contact more readily, spoke up in classes where they'd previously remained silent. "I'm glad things are better for you," Arya said, and meant it. "But you should know that what happened in the cafeteria wasn't really about me. It was about standing up to people who think they can hurt others without consequences." Michael nodded earnestly. "That's what I mean, though. You showed us that it's possible, that we don't have to just accept being treated badly." Over the following weeks, Similar conversations became increasingly common. Students who'd never spoken to Arya before began approaching her, some to thank her, others to share their own stories of harassment and intimidation, still others simply to be in the presence of someone who'd proven that the seemingly impossible was actually achievable. Not all the attention was positive, however. There were students who resented the changes her actions had brought about, who preferred the old system where strength was measured by the ability to intimidate others. A group of juniors led by a boy named Cameron Mitchell had apparently decided that Arya's reputation needed to be challenged if they were going to maintain their own positions in the school's social hierarchy. The confrontation came on a Thursday afternoon in early November, as Arya was walking to her car in the student parking lot. Cameron and 4 of his friends had positioned themselves near her Honda Civic, clearly waiting for her to arrive. Unlike Brandon's crew, these boys were more subtle in their approach, less overtly aggressive, but no less dangerous for their restraint. "Arya Nakamura," Cameron said as she approached, his tone conversational, but with an edge that suggested this wasn't a friendly encounter. "We've been wanting to meet you." Cameron was tall and lean, with the kind of carefully cultivated bad boy image that appealed to certain segments of the student population. His father was a defense attorney who specialized in getting wealthy kids out of trouble, and Cameron had inherited both his father's silver tongue and his casual disregard for other people's well-being. "Cameron Mitchell," Arya replied, recognizing him from several of her classes. "And what can I do for you?" "See, we've been talking," Cameron continued, beginning to circle her car in a way that was clearly meant to be intimidating. "And we think there might be some misunderstandings about what happened with Brandon and his boys. Some people are saying you're some kind of superhero or something, but we think maybe they just weren't as tough as everyone thought." His friends laughed appreciatively, though Arya noticed that they kept their distance, apparently having learned something from Brandon's experience about the dangers of underestimating her. "I'm not interested in fighting anyone," Arya said calmly, fishing her car keys from her backpack. "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to go home." "But that's the thing," Cameron said, stepping closer, but still maintaining what he apparently considered a safe distance. "We don't think you're really all that special. We think you got lucky, and now you're riding that luck to a reputation you haven't earned." It was a familiar dynamic, Arya realized, the same need to test and challenge that had driven Brandon to escalate their conflict beyond reason. Cameron wasn't interested in actually fighting her. He was interested in proving to his friends and himself that he wasn't afraid of the girl who'd become Jefferson High's unofficial protector. "What exactly are you proposing?" Arya asked, though she suspected she already knew. "A test," Cameron replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nothing dramatic, nothing that's going to get anyone arrested. Just a little demonstration to prove that you're not as untouchable as people seem to think." One of his friends, a stocky boy named Travis, with arms covered in amateur tattoos, stepped forward with obvious eagerness. "I've been training in mixed martial arts for 3 years, he announced proudly. "Real training, not just some karate kid bullshit. I bet I could take you easy." Arya studied Travis with the analytical eye her grandfather had taught her to apply to any potential opponent. He was strong, that much was obvious, and his stance suggested he did indeed have some legitimate training, but there was something in his posture, a subtle tells, that suggested his confidence was based more on gym bragging than actual combat experience. "I'm not interested in proving anything to you," Arya said, moving toward her car door, "and I'd suggest you think very carefully about whether this is really a path you want to go down." "What's the matter?" Cameron taunted. "Afraid your reputation might not survive an actual fair fight?" The accusation stung, not because Arya doubted her abilities, but because it touched on something she'd been wrestling with since the cafeteria incident. Had her actions really been about justice and self-defense? Or had there been an element of pride and ego involved? Her grandfather had always warned her about the seductive nature of violence, the way it could become an end in itself rather than a last resort. A fair fight, Arya repeated thoughtfully. And what would that look like? Cameron's eyes lit up with anticipation, apparently sensing that she was wavering. Simple, you and Travis, one-on-one, behind the school after everyone's gone home. No weapons, no friends jumping in, just skill against skill. And if I refuse? Then we'll know you're not as tough as everyone thinks, Cameron said with a shrug. And maybe some of the people who've been looking up to you lately will realize they've been worshipping a fraud. It was a clever trap, Arya had to admit. Refuse the challenge, and her reputation would suffer, potentially undermining the positive changes her actions had brought about. Accept it, and she'd be validating the same toxic masculinity and culture of violence that she'd been trying to combat. I'll think about it, she said finally, getting into her car and starting the engine. You do that, Cameron called after her as she pulled out of the parking space. But don't think too long. Word has a way of getting around, and people are going to start wondering why the great Arya Nakamura is suddenly so reluctant to back up her reputation. As Arya drove home through the grey November afternoon, she found herself thinking about her grandfather's teachings on the nature of strength and the warrior's path. He'd always emphasized that true power lay not in the ability to defeat others, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when it was not. But he'd also taught her that sometimes a warrior had to fight, not because they wanted to, but because others needed them to. The question was whether this situation fell into that category, or whether Cameron was simply trying to manipulate her into validating his own worldview. That evening, as she practiced her forms in the garage that her parents had converted into a makeshift dojo, Arya found herself moving through the familiar sequences with unusual intensity. Her grandfather's presence seemed particularly strong tonight, his voice echoing in her memory as she flowed from one technique to the next. The true warrior fights not for glory or pride, he'd told her countless times, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves. But remember, little tiger, sometimes the greatest protection you can offer is to demonstrate that bullies and cowards will always face consequences for their actions. The next morning at school, word of Cameron's challenge had already begun to spread through the usual network of gossip and speculation. Students whispered in the hallways about whether Arya would accept, what the outcome might be, and what it would mean for the delicate new balance of power that had emerged in the wake of Brandon's downfall. Sarah Chen found Arya at her locker before first period, her face flushed with indignation. "Did you hear what Cameron Mitchell is saying about you?" she demanded without preamble. "I heard it directly from him," Arya replied calmly, organizing her books for the morning's classes. "He wants to arrange a fight to test whether I'm as capable as people think." "You're not seriously considering it, are you?" Sarah asked, her voice rising enough to attract glances from passing students. "It's obviously a trap. Even if you win, it just makes you look like someone who solves problems with violence." "And if I don't accept?" Arya asked. "What happens to all the students who've started standing up for themselves because they believe someone has their back?" Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with the implications. "I don't know," she admitted, "but there has to be another way." Throughout the morning, Arya found herself approached by students expressing opinions on both sides of the issue. Some urged her to accept Cameron's challenge, arguing that backing down would undo all the positive changes of the past month. Others insisted that fighting would only perpetuate the cycle of violence that had made Jefferson High such a toxic environment in the first place. The most interesting perspective came from Derek Chen, who found her during lunch in the library, where she'd taken to eating to avoid the cafeteria's increasingly circus-like atmosphere. "I've been thinking about what Cameron's really trying to do," Derek said, settling into the chair across from her with his own brown bag lunch. And I don't think it's about testing your fighting skills at all. What do you think it's about? Arya asked, curious to hear his analysis. Power, Derek replied immediately. See, right now, you represent something that threatens the entire system guys like Cameron depend on. You've shown that the strong don't always win, that victims can become victors, that the whole hierarchy we've all been living under is basically built on lies. Derek paused to take a bite of his sandwich before continuing. But if he can force you into a fight, especially one where you're fighting just to prove how tough you are instead of to protect someone, then he wins either way. Either you lose and your reputation is destroyed, or you win and prove that you're just another bully who happens to be better at violence than the rest of us. It was an insightful analysis, and it crystallized something that had been bothering Arya since Cameron's challenge. The fight he was proposing wasn't really about martial arts skill or physical strength. It was about whether she would allow herself to be drawn into the same toxic dynamics that had made Brandon such a destructive force in the first place. So what do you think I should do? Arya asked. Derek was quiet for a long moment, staring out the library windows at the grey afternoon sky. I think, he said finally, that you should do what you've been doing all along. Stand up for people who need help, refuse to be intimidated, but don't let anyone trick you into fighting just to prove a point. That afternoon, as students gathered in the parking lot with the obvious expectation that some kind of confrontation was imminent, Arya made her decision. Instead of heading directly to her car, she walked over to where Cameron and his friends were waiting, their body language suggesting they were confident she would accept their challenge. I've thought about your proposal, Arya said, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp November air. And I'm going to decline. Cameron's face lit up with triumph, apparently believing that her refusal proved his point about her being a fraud. I thought you might, he said loudly enough for the gathered crowd to hear. Guess we know now what the great Arya Nakamura is really made of. Do we? Arya asked, her tone conversational, but with an edge that made several students take an unconscious step backward. Because I'm curious about something, Cameron. What exactly do you think you're proving here? The question seemed to catch Cameron off guard, as if he'd expected her to either accept his challenge or slink away in shame. I'm proving that you're not as tough as everyone thinks, he said, but with less conviction than before. By challenging me to a fight that has nothing to do with protecting anyone or standing up to injustice, Arya continued. By trying to turn me into the same kind of person you are, someone who uses violence to maintain their social status. She stepped closer to Cameron, close enough that he had to tilt his head back slightly to maintain eye contact. Here's what I think, Cameron. I think you're terrified of what my actions have meant for people like you. You've built your identity around being someone others are afraid of, and now you're desperate to prove that the old rules still apply. Cameron's face flushed red, but whether from anger or embarrassment was difficult to tell. You don't know what you're talking about, he said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had held moments before. Don't I? Arya asked, because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're exactly what I thought you were, a coward who only feels strong when he's making others feel weak. The gathered crowd had gone completely silent now, recognizing that they were witnessing something different from the typical high school confrontation. This wasn't about physical dominance or territorial disputes. It was about the fundamental nature of power and how it should be wielded. You want to know what real strength looks like? Arya continued, her voice carrying to every student in the parking lot. It's Michael Torres standing up to a senior who was hassling him yesterday instead of just taking it. It's Jennifer Walsh speaking up in class when she sees someone being ridiculed for asking a question. It's Derek Chen admitting he was wrong and working to make amends. She gestured to the crowd of students surrounding them. It's not beating people up to prove how tough you are, Cameron. That's not strength. That's just fear dressed up as aggression. Travis, Cameron's friend, who'd been so eager to test his MMA training against her, shifted uncomfortably. "So you're just going to walk away?" he asked. "Refuse to fight, and then act like that makes you better than us?" "I'm going to do what I've always done," Arya replied simply. "Defend people who need defending, stand up to bullies who think they can intimidate others without consequences, and refuse to let people like you drag me down to your level." She turned to address the wider group of students who'd gathered to watch what they'd expected to be a dramatic confrontation. "Cameron wants me to fight his friend to prove I'm as good as my reputation suggests. But my reputation isn't based on beating people up for entertainment. It's based on protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." A murmur ran through the crowd as students began to understand the distinction she was drawing. Several nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful, as if seeing the situation from a perspective they hadn't considered before. "So, here's my counter-challenge," Arya announced, her voice carrying absolute confidence. "Instead of proving how tough we are by beating each other up, why don't we prove how strong we are by making Jefferson High a place where everyone feels safe, where students don't have to choose between being predators or prey?" Cameron opened his mouth as if to respond, but seemed to realize that anything he said would only make him look smaller by comparison. The crowd was clearly not reacting the way he'd expected. Instead of seeing Arya's refusal to fight as weakness, they were beginning to understand it as a different kind of strength entirely. "Think about it," Arya continued, beginning to walk toward her car. "What's harder, beating someone up or choosing not to when you could? What takes more courage, proving you're the toughest person in the parking lot, or standing up for someone who's being bullied, even when it's not your fight?" As she reached her Honda Civic, she turned back to address Cameron one final time. "You wanted to test me, Cameron. Consider this your answer. I'm strong enough not to need your validation, and confident enough in my principles not to compromise them for your entertainment." The silence that followed her departure was profound, broken only by the sound of car engines starting as students began to disperse. Many lingered, however, engaged in animated discussions about what they'd just witnessed and what it meant for their understanding of strength, courage, and the proper use of power. Cameron and his friends left quickly, their body language suggesting that the confrontation had not gone at all as they'd planned. Travis, in particular, looked thoughtful, as if Arya's words had made him reconsider some fundamental assumptions about what it meant to be strong. Over the following weeks, the effects of Arya's refusal to fight became increasingly apparent throughout Jefferson High. Students who had been considering testing themselves against her reputation instead began focusing their energy on more constructive pursuits. The casual violence and intimidation that had been so common just months before became increasingly rare, replaced by a culture that valued moral courage over physical dominance. But perhaps the most significant change was in the way conflicts were resolved when they did arise. Instead of escalating to violence or administrative intervention, students began mediating their own disputes, often using principles that echoed Arya's approach to the Cameron situation. They asked harder questions about motivation and consequence, looked for solutions that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms, and increasingly chose de-escalation over confrontation. Mrs. Patterson, the AP English teacher, began incorporating discussions of real-world courage into her curriculum, using recent events at Jefferson High as case studies in moral decision-making. "Literature is full of heroes who solve problems through violence," she told her classes. "But what does it mean to be heroic in a world where the most courageous act might be choosing not to fight?" The question resonated throughout the school, sparking debates and discussions that continued long after classes ended. Students found themselves examining their own behavior and motivations in ways they never had before, asking whether their actions contributed to the kind of community they wanted to be part of. Arya herself found that her role at Jefferson High had evolved in ways she hadn't anticipated. She was no longer just the girl who'd stood up to Brandon Reeves. She'd become something approaching a moral compass for the entire school community. Students sought her out not for protection or validation, but for perspective on complex ethical questions. When a group of sophomores discovered that one of their teachers was having an inappropriate relationship with a student, they came to Arya for advice on how to handle the situation responsibly. When the debate team was divided over whether to use a particularly devastating piece of opposition research that had been obtained through questionable means, they asked for her input on the ethics of competitive advantage. Most importantly, when conflicts arose between students, they increasingly looked to the principles Arya had demonstrated rather than the traditional power dynamics that had governed Jefferson High for so long. Instead of asking who's stronger or who has more social status, they began asking who's right and what solution serves the greater good. The administration noticed these changes as well, and Principal Matthews found himself dealing with a dramatically different school environment than the one he'd inherited when Brandon Reeves had ruled through intimidation and fear. Disciplinary incidents were down by nearly 60%, academic performance was improving across all grade levels, and teacher satisfaction surveys showed the highest ratings in the district. "I've been in education for 23 years, Principal Matthews told Arya during one of their monthly check-in meetings, "and I've never seen a single student have such a positive impact on an entire school community." "It wasn't just me," Arya replied, though she appreciated the recognition. "Everyone chose to embrace a different way of being. I just demonstrated that it was possible." "Don't sell yourself short," Principal Matthews insisted. "Leadership means showing people what's possible and inspiring them to be better than they thought they could be. That's exactly what you've done here." As winter turned to spring and Arya's senior year progressed toward graduation, she began receiving inquiries from colleges and universities that had heard about the changes at Jefferson High. Harvard's program in Mind, Brain, and Behavior wanted to study her approach to conflict resolution. Stanford's International Relations Department was interested in her perspective on violence prevention. Even West Point's Department of Behavioral Sciences and Leadership had reached out to discuss her understanding of moral courage in leadership contexts. The attention was flattering, but Arya found herself most interested in programs that focused on practical applications of conflict resolution and peace building. She'd seen firsthand how dramatically a community could change when its members committed to principles of mutual respect and constructive problem-solving, and she wanted to learn how to facilitate similar transformations on a larger scale. Her grandfather's influence remained strong in her thinking, but she was beginning to understand that his teachings had been preparation for something bigger than just personal self-defense. The martial arts he'd taught her were ultimately about harmony, finding balance between opposing forces, redirecting negative energy toward positive outcomes, and understanding that true victory came not from defeating opponents, but from transforming conflicts. "You have learned well, little tiger," she could almost hear his voice saying during her evening practice sessions. "But your real education is just beginning. The world needs warriors who understand that the greatest battles are fought not with fists or weapons, but with wisdom and compassion." As her final semester at Jefferson High progressed, Arya found herself reflecting on the dramatic changes that had occurred not just in her own life, but in the lives of everyone around her. Brandon Reeves, once the school's most feared bully, was reportedly doing well in the alternative program where he'd been placed after his expulsion. According to Derek, who'd maintained some contact with their former tormentor, Brandon was working with a counselor to understand the roots of his aggressive behavior and had even begun volunteering with younger students who'd been identified as potential bullies. Tyler Morrison had completed his suspension and returned to Jefferson High a changed person. Instead of seeking to rebuild his association with the popular crowd, he joined the school's peer mediation program and was training to help other students resolve conflicts peacefully. His transformation was perhaps the most dramatic of all Brandon's former crew, as he seemed to have internalized the lessons of their confrontation with Arya in ways that fundamentally altered his worldview. Derek Chen had emerged as a natural leader in the new Jefferson High culture, organizing study groups that brought together students from different social circles and spearheading a mentorship program that paired upperclassmen with younger students who were struggling academically or socially. His sister Sarah had been elected to the student council on a platform of continuing the positive changes that had begun the previous fall. Even students who hadn't been directly involved in the original conflicts found their lives improved by the cultural shift Arya's actions had catalyzed. Academic competition became more collaborative, with students helping each other succeed rather than trying to ensure others failed. Social hierarchies became more fluid and based on genuine merit rather than the ability to intimidate or manipulate others. The changes extended beyond Jefferson High as well. Parents began hearing different stories from their children, accounts of kindness and mutual support rather than bullying and exclusion. Local businesses noticed that groups of Jefferson High students were more polite and respectful when they visited shops and restaurants near the school. Even the police reported a significant decrease in calls related to teenage disturbances and vandalism in the area. But perhaps the most meaningful change for Arya personally was the evolution of her relationship with her parents. As the full scope of her capabilities and the principles that guided her became clear, her mother and father gained a deeper appreciation for the lessons her grandfather had tried to impart through years of patient instruction. "I always wondered why your grandfather spent so much time teaching you those old fighting techniques," her father said during one of their family dinners that had become increasingly frequent and meaningful. "I thought he was just sharing cultural traditions, or maybe trying to give you confidence. I never understood that he was preparing you to be a force for positive change in the world. He used to tell me that every generation produces a few individuals who have the opportunity to shift the course of history," her mother added. "I thought he was being overly dramatic, but now I'm beginning to see what he meant." Arya felt the weight of their expectations, but also the strength that came from understanding her place in a larger tradition of people who'd chosen to use their abilities in service of justice and protection rather than personal gain or domination. Her grandfather's teachings were part of a lineage that stretched back centuries, connecting her to warriors and philosophers who'd grappled with the same fundamental questions about power, responsibility, and the proper use of strength. As graduation approached, Jefferson High's senior class was widely regarded as one of the most remarkable in the school's history, not because of their test scores or college admissions, though both were impressive, but because of the way they'd learned to treat each other and solve problems together. The lessons they'd absorbed about moral courage, principled conflict resolution, and the difference between strength and aggression would serve them well long after they left the familiar hallways of their high school. The graduation ceremony itself was a celebration not just of academic achievement, but of personal growth and community transformation. Principal Matthews used his address to reflect on the changes he'd witnessed over the past year, noting that the class of senior year represented a new model for what was possible when young people committed themselves to principles of mutual respect and constructive problem-solving. "You have shown us," he told the assembled graduates and their families, "that real leadership isn't about dominating others or proving your superiority through intimidation. Real leadership is about inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be, and having the courage to do what's right even when it's difficult or unpopular." Arya was selected as the class valedictorian, not because she had the highest GPA, though her academic performance was excellent, but because her classmates recognized her as the person who'd most embodied the values they wanted to be remembered for. Her speech was brief but powerful, focusing on the lessons she'd learned about the difference between strength and violence, the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and the responsibility that came with being able to make a positive difference in the world. My grandfather used to tell me that true warriors fight not for glory or personal gain, but to protect those who cannot protect themselves, she told the audience. But he also taught me that the greatest battles are often won without throwing a single punch, and that the strongest people are those who have the courage to choose peace when violence would be easier. She paused to look out at her fellow graduates, many of whom had been personally touched by the events of the past year. We've learned together that it's possible to create communities based on mutual respect rather than fear, on collaboration rather than competition, on lifting each other up rather than tearing each other down. As we leave Jefferson High and move on to the next chapters of our lives, I hope we'll take these lessons with us and continue working to make the world a place where everyone feels safe and valued. The standing ovation that followed her speech lasted for several minutes, with many audience members visibly moved by her words and the transformation they'd witnessed in the Jefferson High community. For Arya, it was a moment of profound satisfaction, not because of the recognition she'd received, but because of the knowledge that she'd played a role in creating something lasting and meaningful. As summer arrived and her classmates dispersed to colleges and universities across the country, Arya found herself preparing for her own next chapter. She'd been accepted to several prestigious programs, but had ultimately chosen Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, where she planned to study international conflict resolution with a focus on preventing violence through education and community building. The decision felt right, connecting her grandfather's teachings about individual moral courage to larger questions about how societies could organize themselves around principles of justice and mutual respect, rather than power and domination. She wanted to learn how the lessons of Jefferson High could be applied to larger communities and eventually to international conflicts where the stakes were far higher than high school social dynamics. But even as she prepared to leave Millbrook and Jefferson High behind, Arya knew that the experiences of her senior year would continue to shape her understanding of leadership, courage, and the proper use of strength for years to come. She'd learned that real power lay not in the ability to defeat others, but in the wisdom to know when fighting was necessary and when it was not. She discovered that the greatest victories were often achieved through restraint rather than aggression, and that true leadership meant inspiring others to be better than they thought they could be. Most importantly, she'd proven to herself and others that it was possible to break cycles of violence and intimidation, to create communities based on mutual respect and support, and to use whatever abilities one possessed in service of justice and protection rather than personal gain or domination. As she packed her belongings for the move to Washington, D.C., Arya came across the small silver pendant her grandfather had given her, the tiger's claw that had hung around her neck throughout her time at Jefferson High. She held it up to the light, remembering his words about the nature of true strength and the warrior's path. "The tiger is strong," he'd told her during one of their training sessions, "but its greatest power lies not in its claws or its fierce roar, but in its wisdom to know when to strike and when to show mercy. Remember this, little tiger, the strongest predator is the one that chooses to protect rather than destroy." She fastened the pendant around her neck once more, feeling the familiar weight of it against her chest. Tomorrow, she would begin a new journey, but the lessons her grandfather had taught her and the experiences she'd gained at Jefferson High would travel with her, guiding her as she worked to apply those principles in service of a larger mission. Years later, when Brandon Reeves was working at his father's insurance agency and trying to rebuild his reputation through community service, he would still sometimes dream about that day in the cafeteria when he'd learned the difference between actual strength and the illusion of power. Tyler Morrison, who'd managed to turn his life around after the incident, became a social worker specializing in helping troubled teenagers avoid the mistakes he'd made. Derek Chen went on to medical school and eventually became a pediatrician, driven in part by his memories of the vulnerable students he'd failed to protect during his time at Jefferson High. He kept a small photo on his office desk of Arya receiving her diploma, a reminder of the courage it took to do the right thing even when the cost was high. And Arya herself, she went on to study international relations and conflict resolution, eventually working for organizations that specialized in preventing violence through understanding and diplomacy. But she never forgot the lessons her grandfather had taught her, or the day when those lessons had been tested in the most public way possible. She'd proven that strength didn't have to come at the expense of others, that justice was sometimes worth fighting for, and that even the quietest person could find their voice when it mattered most. In the end, those might have been the most important lessons Jefferson High School ever taught, not just to her, but to an entire generation of students who learned that real power came from lifting others up rather than tearing them down, and that the courage to stand up for what's right was the most valuable strength of all.